Oh, I hope that was for me. Welcome, everyone. I'm Diana Ingram. I'm the executive director here at Hill Center at the Old Naval Hospital. And I see a lot of familiar faces, but I also see some folks that may not have been here before. Is there anyone who's never been at Hill Center before?
Is your microphone
Yay.
not on? Is it?
I think we're doing the sound check as I natter on about who's been in the building and hasn't been in the building. Okay, I think we're on. Okay, super.
All right.
So, welcome everyone to Talk of the Hill with Bill Press. Please take a moment to turn off your mobile devices, and please take a moment to look in your program. We have some other fabulous, exciting events coming on. I don't know what Bill's next program will be, but I would like everyone to join me in a round of applause for Bill Press, who...
But I don't know what my next program is either.
It will be a surprise and delightful. Who created this really super strand that welcomes the most fascinating authors and personalities of our time to Hill Center, including our guest this evening. East City Books is here, and books are available for sale. Dinner at the White House. I mean, my gosh, what could be more exciting? We are streaming this, so hello, anyone tuning in. And I just want to remind folks that many of our Talk of the Hill with Bill Press and all kinds of invitees, from nuns to bishops to senators to Alice Waters to Ina Garten to other fabulous food people, are up on our YouTube channel. And there are about 100 of them. And they're really quite terrific, so please tune in. Bill and Alex will be in conversation for about a half an hour or so, and then open up for questions. So please wait for the microphone during the Q&A period, because we are streaming it. And buy lots of books and come back. We love having you here. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming out this evening. I mentioned the last time we were here with Martin Walker, mostly we talk politics, but whenever we deviate from politics, we end up going to food. And here we are again tonight. And I have to tell you, Alex Prud'homme, author of Dinner with the President. I have the hard copy here. It is one of the books that I most enjoyed last year. It's a fascinating book, very well written, lots of great stories, lots of good history. And just a really fun book. So it's a great treat to welcome Alex to the Hill Center tonight. Alex is author, of course, of Dinner with the President, also co-author with Julia Childs of My Life in France, which is particularly significant because Alex is his grandfather was Paul Childs' twin brother. So Alex is the great-nephew of Paul Childs, right?
Bravo.
How about that?
You got it.
Right. Now, I want you to know, he's not the only food celebrity in the house, because also with us tonight, you know that Julia Childs wrote The Art of French Cooking with two other women, one of whom is Simone Beck. And with us tonight is a good friend who lives on the Hill, and who's Simone Beck's nephew, Jean-François Thibault. Front row. And if you think that's all the connections, know that there's one more. Alex is also married to Sarah, who is the third cousin of my wife, Carol. So, this is a family affair tonight, Alex. So I've got to ask you for the first question, why should anybody care what the presidents eat? Does it make any difference? Does it ever have any influence?
Well, the simple answer is we all have to eat, right? We're all human beings, and food has long been used as a tool to bring people together. It's been, because of that, politicians going back to prehistory have used food to gather people and break bread together, the old phrase. And it turns out that this is a very powerful primal drive. We human beings like to eat together. And recently there's been some science done on this, and it turns out that when we eat in a community, it releases endorphins, which are the feel-good opioids that our bodies secrete. And that reinforces good behaviors. So not only do we like to eat together, but we're kind of biologically programmed to eat together. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that traditionally the table has been considered a neutral space. It's away from the press and the pressures of society. It's a place where people can put their weapons aside, have frank conversations, maybe have a laugh, share a meal, broker deals, sometimes broker marriages. So food has been this great connector. It's actually a means of communication. And so when you look at the foods of the presidency, these are arguably some of the most important and tasty foods in the world. The White House is not only a symbol of the republic, as Jackie Kennedy put it, but it's also an actual functioning home. And there are food events that happen there virtually every day. And these aren't simply means of sustenance. They are symbolically important. They're sending out a series of signals and signs and messages to people, different audiences. And believe it or not, the public pays close attention to what the president eats. So when you have a president like Obama, who eats very healthily and pushes people to have exercise, a lot of the public follow suit and plant their own gardens and eat just 7 almonds for a snack. But then when Donald Trump was president, people on both sides of the aisle felt free to eat as much junk food as they wanted because the great leader was doing that. And so it's fascinating. It's really a primal thing. And I was attracted to this subject because food, it tells you a lot about these presidents as individual human beings, with their sometimes quirky tastes. Ronald Reagan with his jelly beans and Richard Nixon with his cottage cheese. And we can talk about some of that stuff later, but it also tells you about the state of the nation in any given era, the state of the world, the mechanization and modernization of the country. If you look at George Washington starving at Valley Forge, foraging for mushrooms in the winter of 1777, all the way up to the highly processed foods of our recent presidents. That narrative arc is absolutely fascinating, and it's sort of a pocket history of America as seen through this very particular lens of food. And so I just find it fascinating.
So every household really runs on food, doesn't it? I mean, and so the White House runs on food. How do they order their groceries? Where do they go to Trader Joe's? Right?
Well, it used to be that they would just send a van out around town and they'd have a shopping list and they'd buy from various vendors. But then, after several assassination attempts, particularly Ronald Reagan getting shot by John Hinckley, that was the first really big one where suddenly they realized that the food supply was a vulnerability at the White House. And then after 9/11, things got really locked down. And so I asked that question, and it turns out that what happens is they make it very obscure. There are only a few vendors that they use. Any vendor that tells the world that they're supplying the White House is immediately cut off. They don't actually know who they're supplying. The vendors know that they're supplying the U.S. government, but they don't know which branch. And so anonymous vans pick up foods and bring them to central warehouses. There are several of them all around town, all top secret. And then the White House chefs can requisition certain things like a ripe strawberry or a perfect tomato or a beautiful piece of halibut, whatever it is. And so the vendors don't actually know where this is going. So it's not impossible, but it'd be very difficult to poison the president these days.
Yeah. Before we move on, you mentioned about the influence of some presidents with certain foods. So did sales of broccoli go down with George H.W. Bush?
You may remember that George H.W. Bush had a little conniption fit and said, "I don't like broccoli. I never liked it, and my mother made me eat it, and now I'm the president. I don't have to." He had a temper tantrum, and he passed it off as a joke, but I think it was kind of serious, you know. And the broccoli farmers were outraged by this because they were afraid that their sales would plummet, and so they shipped 10 tons of broccoli to the White House in protest. And Barbara Bush went out in front of the cameras and said, "Well, I like broccoli. I'm going to make broccoli soup and broccoli tacos and broccoli this and that." And she ended up giving most of it to soup kitchens around town. But the funny thing was that there was a Polish delegation at the White House when all this was happening, and they don't eat broccoli. They had no idea what Broccoli Gate was all about.
Oh.
And they were totally confused. What is this broccoli, you know? So I think the answer is it didn't really affect broccoli sales. It might have actually helped it because people weren't thinking about broccoli, and suddenly they realized that they actually liked broccoli. So.
Well, in terms of special foods, we're also very pleased tonight to welcome a very important man on the Hill. Mike, I'm not even sure Mike's last name, but we all know him, he runs the cheese shop in the Eastern Market. Alors, so you must have some stories about fromage at the White House.
Ah, mais oui, bien sûr. Well, there are a couple of famous cheese stories, Mike, but I'm not sure they're going to.
By the way,
you're going to approve of them.
We all know, I think I told you just before we came up, that the vice president, her last visit to our neighborhood, stopped, of course, at the Eastern Market to Mike's shop and loaded up with cheese from Wisconsin. And
Well, yeah, she likes the French truffle brie and a few other things.
yeah, so there's a little
My
White House
impression is she's a
connection.
real foodie, and she knows her food. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyhow, you were saying that.
Yeah. Okay, well, so there is a tradition of gift foods to the White House. And this began back in Thomas Jefferson's day when an enterprising dairy farmer from upstate New York shipped Jefferson a gigantic cheese. I think it was a cheddar-like cheese from upstate New York. And he built a special cart. It was huge and heavy. And he drove it down with great fanfare to the White House. And it was festooned with American flags. And it was he posed it as a tribute to the president. Really, it was a self-promotional tool, of course, in classic American fashion. And Jefferson, who was careful about the politics and the optics of this kind of situation, made sure to not only pay him for the cheese, but paid more than it was actually worth to thank him for doing that. And this began a whole series of food tributes to the president. One of my favorites is the salmon tribute that used to happen every year. The first salmon caught in Maine was sent down as a tribute to the president. And then it came time for Herbert Hoover, who was a real fisherman. But he was also an engineer, and he ran a very tight kitchen. And the salmon arrived. The kitchen immediately gutted it, beheaded it, put it in the freezer. Whereupon the senator from Maine showed up looking for a photograph with the president and salmon. So they fished the head out, sewed it back on, took the picture, and away they went. Everybody was happy. Anyway, the next cheese story happened during Andrew Jackson's presidency when another gigantic cheese was presented to the White House. And he displayed it in the front hall of the White House in that beautiful marble floor. And people ate a little bit, but it wasn't super popular, so he stashed it in the basement, where it began to molder away and grow green and, interesting shapes. And then it came time to have a party. It was a spring party, I believe. And he said, I got to get rid of this cheese. It's starting to stink up the house. So he brought it back up, scraped off the mold, and then provided an orange rum punch. Now, as you may recall, he was sort of a proto-Donald Trump. He was a real populist. And so his audience was enthusiastic, shall we say. And they came in and helped themselves to the punch, and then they attacked the cheese and got so carried away that they began to smush it into the carpets and rip down some of the curtains and essentially trash the White House. And there was so much cheese smushed into the White House that it took months to fumigate. And they were afraid that they're going to have to redecorate the whole place because the cheese was stinking up the place. So maybe not the kind of story you were looking for, but it's kind of entertaining. But I think recent presidents have come to embrace the French model of serving cheese at the end of the meal. And Kamala Harris, for example, certainly appreciates it. I grew up in a foodie kind of francophone family, and we always had a lot of cheese. And my Yankee wife did not, and she thinks I'm weird because I like to have cheese all the time. But I think I'll have to stop by, Mike, and see what you got. So,
By the way, I meant to say this earlier, but we've certainly come up in the world with a little Prosecco to start with. I think it's a very nice addition to the Talk of the Hill, thanks to Diana and to Mary Ann Frama. So let's talk about some famous dinners as you said, there are food events every day at the White House, actually. But some famous presidential dinners, starting with maybe the most famous of all, the bargain over the dinner table, or the dinner table bargain, I guess they call it, right? Which
that's right.
I think we've all heard about, but give us a little quick
this was
history of that.
This was in the very early days of the United States. So George Washington had been president for just a year, and this was 1790. And so the American democracy was an idea more than an actual functioning system. And it was a work in progress. And so there were a lot of competing interests, and there weren't many rules or guardrails, and there were tremendous political factions working for and against each other. And one of the worst fights going on at that point was between Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Hamilton represented the northern states, Madison the south. And the big dispute was over two issues that seem kind of obscure today. The first was, how do we repay our Revolutionary War debts, which really meant, can we impose taxes by the federal government, or should it be done by the states, and how do we create a financial system? And the second was, where to site the new federal capital. At the time, the capital was a temporary one. It was in New York City. And there was a big battle over whether that New York should be the capital, or Philadelphia, or a southern site. And this fight got to be so toxic that Hamilton and Madison stopped talking to each other. And Thomas Jefferson, who was the, what was he then? He was Secretary of State, I guess, at that point, right? Yeah.
Right.
So Secretary of State, and who was a very savvy food guy. He had been the ambassador to France. He really understood the power of food as a political tool. He was worried that this fight would rip the young republic apart. It was that serious. And so he took a page from the French court that he observed, and he invited these two combatants over to his house on Maiden Lane, which is now in Greenwich Village, for a secret dinner. Nobody knew about it. And so the two men come in. They won't even look at each other or talk to each other. Hamilton is feigning indifference. He gives them each some beautiful white wine from France. He starts talking about this and that and everything but these big issues. In the meantime, the room begins to fill up with these wonderful aromas coming out of the kitchen. And that was from James Hemings, who was Jefferson's enslaved chef, the brother of Sally Hemings. One of the brothers of Sally Hemings. And so Hemings was creating this wonderful meal. He began with a Jeffersonian salad with a beautiful tarragon dressing, and then capons cooked in cream, and a braised beef dish. And all along, Jefferson's plying the combatants with beautiful wine after wine. And as the collagens and the alcohol began to take over, their shoulders relaxed, and they actually began to talk to each other like human beings. And to finish them off, he served them brandy, French brandy, and a pièce de résistance dessert, which was a cold vanilla ice cream, which Americans did not know about at the time, served in a warm puff pastry. And it completely blew their mind. It was something that they couldn't even imagine. And it worked magic, because by the end of that, they agreed to a compromise whereby the federal capital would be located today in Washington, D.C., but there would be a temporary period of 10 years when it was in Philadelphia. And Hamilton was allowed to construct a financial system that would impose taxes by the federal government. And one of the reasons I love this story is because it was a crucial moment in American history that happened around the dinner table in its earliest days. And it has current resonance because we're still fighting over about taxation and states' rights and so on. Some people still don't like Washington as the federal capital. And as you may recall in the musical Hamilton, there's a song about this dinner. It's called "The Room Where It Happened," which is rapped by a jealous Aaron Burr, who was not invited to the dinner and wished he'd been there. And one can only imagine if he had been there, maybe things would have turned out differently. Right. But it's remarkable because you had two future presidents and probably a third future president, had he not been shot, at this dinner, kind of creating America over this sumptuous meal cooked by an enslaved chef. And I just think it kind of encapsulates so much in one meal.
Right. Another famous, of all the famous dinners at the White House, I picked a couple here from your book. Teddy Roosevelt, October 16, 1901. Why
Yep.
significant? Not a state dinner, but why significant?
A very simple dinner on the surface of it. He invited Booker T. Washington over for dinner to the White House. Now, you remember TR was the youngest president. He inherited his presidency when McKinley was shot. And there was a month-long period of mourning for McKinley. And at the very end of that month, he invited Booker T. Washington, who he knew and had looked to for advice. You may recall Booker T. Washington was born a slave, but became a black academic. He was the founding president of the Tuskegee Institute. He was a wonderful writer. And he was a very thoughtful man. And Roosevelt respected him. And he just invited him over to the White House. There was a third guest who was a businessman, and just the three of them at a simple dinner at the White House, no press or anything. And as is tradition at the time, the newspapers just mentioned the people who had eaten at the dinner, eaten at the White House that night. Well, this set off a firebomb, a racially tinged firebomb. People called Roosevelt a negrophilist, amongst many other much more horrible things than that.
It was the first time, right? A black man had been invited.
And this was the thing. It was the first time that a black man had been invited to dinner at the White House as a putative equal to the president. There had been black people invited to the White House, but not as equal participants. And Roosevelt hadn't really thought this through. He really respected Washington. And this bomb went off, not only in the South, also in the North. And he felt really burned by this. He didn't regret it, but his advisors said, you can't do this again because it's just too negative. And it was a real smack in the nose for the very young president, and it made him a little more leery of taking risks like that. But it was a very important moment, also symbolically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not chronologically, but jumping back, the first state dinner, and I want to get into the Julius state dinner with you too, but the first state dinner, Ulysses S. Grant, right? And the state dinner was for what we don't no longer consider the head of a foreign government.
That's right. It was for King Kalakaua of the Sandwich Islands, which we now call Hawaii. And this was in 1874. U.S. Grant was the president. Kalakaua and his island nation were sinking into a sea of debt, but they had a lot of sugar and other agricultural products to sell to the United States. The problem was that we had very high tariffs to protect the California sugar farmers and others. And so Kalakaua arranged a meeting with U.S. Grant in Washington, and he made this kind of highly publicized train trip across the country. He's greeted in Washington with a big parade, and then the first state dinner for a foreign dignitary. And this was Grant, who was a very strategic thinker as a general, buttering up Kalakaua, looking to get a good deal. And this is part of what happens at state dinners. There's usually an economic and a diplomatic many economic and diplomatic issues at stake. And here we are at the very first one. Grant agreed to lower tariffs on the condition that Kalakaua open Pearl Harbor as an exclusive U.S. naval port. And this was a really big deal because it gave us this beachhead way out in the middle of the Pacific, and it allowed our ships to cover much greater territory. But as many of the Hawaiian Islanders feared, it also led to the takeover of the sugar industry by Americans. Famously, there were 7 families that kind of controlled the sugar industry there. And ultimately led to the annexation of the islands. And it was Dwight Eisenhower who named it the 50th state as Hawaii. They were right, it happened. What happened, but the good side of this is that Grant, who was a rough and ready soldier from Missouri, he sort of set the template for what state dinners are today. So Kalakaua was greeted by the Marine Band. There was this beautiful dinner with wonderful decorations. He had a chef named Valentino Mela, who was a Sicilian, who's known as the Professor because he was such a wonderful epicure, but also knew a lot about culinary history. And it was a showcase of some of the finest food in America and a tribute to the guest, King Kalakaua. And so that sort of set the template for what state dinners are.
For state dinner. And there have been, of course, many, many state dinners. And Lyndon Johnson, as you relate in the book, figures we need some publicity about these state dinners and how important they are, and the symbolism and what can result from these state dinners. So he said, let's do a documentary. And to produce this documentary, he reaches out to Aunt Julia and Uncle Paul.
Exactly. Well, it was actually the other way around. So Julia and Paul. So Paul had been a cultural attaché at the U.S. embassies in Paris and the consulate in Marseille, and in Norway and in Germany, and Julia had at that point had been an anonymous diplomatic spouse who became obsessed with French food, with Simca and Loisette, and so they understood the value of state dinners from both a diplomatic and a culinary perspective. And they had the idea of turning this into a documentary, which had never been done before. In fact, TV cameras had never been allowed into the White House kitchen before. Now, LBJ was under fire. There were anti-war protesters during Vietnam. There were rock and rollers. There were racial strife. So he had been kind of hiding out from the public. But as Paul said, Julia could charm a polecat. And she managed to charm the mercurial LBJ, who allowed her to bring TV cameras into the White House kitchen for the first time, where she documented Chef Henry Holler, the executive chef, making this sumptuous dinner. I think he had a lobster tail with caviar along it, and he had a beautiful lamb noisette, and vegetables, and it's beautiful dessert. And she caught this all on camera. But it was shot in film. This is 1967. It was shot on film in black and white, and you can see it on pbs.org. It's called White House Red Carpet. It's fabulous. Julia's wearing this groovy coat and a mod wig. You get to see the back stairways and the small kitchen in the White House. And LBJ had invited Prime Minister Isako Sato of Japan, who was an important ally during Vietnam. As I said, this was a tense period, so this was a big deal. And to have Julia and her cameras there was really remarkable. And it went really well. Tony Bennett was the entertainer that night. He sang his jazz hits, and Sato was a big jazz fan. And Julia said, what's really important about it is these two guys get to know each other as individual human beings, not just as these kind of cardboard figurines. You see in the documentary, the two of them are laughing and carrying on and having a good time. And she says, that's what these state dinners are really all about. It's the human connection. And that was true at U.S. Grant's Day, and it's true today. And that's why the state dinner, I think, still remains relevant and vital in the 21st century.
And were she and Paul at the president's table?
They were not at the president's table, but they were at the dinner. And you're not allowed to film the president eating. There are occasionally, today, there are still photos, but you're not allowed to film him eating. So there's a sort of an ellipses in the middle of the documentary where you see them going in, and then you see them coming out and listening to Tony Bennett.
Oh.
And Julia was so inspired that she ended up doing a second documentary in 1976 when Gerald Ford was president, and he invited Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip to celebrate the bicentennial of 1976 at a white tie state dinner. This was a very different affair. This time, they stretched a big tent over the Rose Garden. Everything was meticulously planned. This was an extra special state dinner. And then right before the meal was to begin, this terrible rainstorm came in off the Potomac, flooded the lawn, knocked down the TV equipment, got Julia's hair wet. The thing was a disaster, and so they had to regroup. They go back. Holler was still the chef there. He made another lobster and a veal, I think this time it was veal dinner, which she shows, this time in color, because by this point they were on videotape in color. There's a funny photograph in the book of Julia leaning over his pots, tasting something, and if you look carefully, you'll see she's in her bare feet, because she was over 6'2", and Holler was a little more vertically challenged, so she didn't want to really tower over him. Despite this beautiful meal, the evening remained a little damp. Bob Hope's jokes didn't really land. When the Queen and the President were dancing together, the band struck up "The Lady is a Tramp," inadvertently. And then the entertainer that night was the Captain and Tennille, who were warbling about muskrat love, which Julia deemed rather unqueenly. But nevertheless, she had a great time being at the White House at the bicentennial with the Queen and the President at this really important moment in history. And it was sort of this moment of gastro-diplomacy.
Yeah, how good could it get?
Yeah.
I want to leave time for your questions. That's just so much fun. But so let me throw out a few names of a few presidents, and you tell us kind of, what comes to mind. Maybe what food. You already mentioned Ronald Reagan with the jelly beans, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. What about Dwight Eisenhower?
Well, actually, I believe that Dwight Eisenhower was our best presidential cook. This was news to me when I was researching the book. I had no idea. I thought I knew who he was. He was this kind of black and white guy who was a general, and I had no idea that he was this fabulous cook. He'd been raised on a farm. He was a hunter and fisherman. He loved to cook, and he was known as the president who cooks. And I include some recipes in the back of the book, one of which is for Eisenhower Steak, which is a real showstopper. It's super easy to do. It's where you get quality coals going in a grill. You take the grill away and you nestle the steak right into the coals. And you sear one side, you flip it over, you sear the other. It leaves it nice and pink on the interior. If there's any ash, you just brush it off. It's absolutely delicious. And I recommend it. It's a good party trick. So I would say Eisenhower Steak.
You do mention, though, another favorite of his, which I have not been willing to try. Squirrel stew.
Oh, squirrel stew, yeah. Yeah, well, as I said, he was a hunter
squirrels
and a
on
fisherman.
Capitol Hill, but
He grew up on a farm, and he liked to go hunting and fishing. And when he was a kid, he used to shoot squirrels. And one time, he made squirrel stew. But he was with some buddies, and they had run low on food. And he told his friends that there was crow stew, because that sounded a little less appetizing. So they only had a little bit, and he had quite a bit. So you saw him, again, he's a military guy. He's a strategic thinker,
Richard Nixon.
Nixon, well, I have two foods for Nixon. The first is his daily lunch, which was a little ball of cottage cheese on a pineapple ring. Sometimes he'd jazz it up with some ketchup. This was California cuisine at its finest. Very healthy, but very bland. There's another cheese story for you. Cheese. Curds. And he had this virtually every day for lunch. And so, it was sort of bland and predictable. He was a very impatient man. He didn't like small talk. He didn't like state dinners. This was very unusual for a career politician. But then he went to China in 1972, and he ate all sorts of exotic things like 1,000-year eggs and shark fin soup. spent hours talking to Zhou Enlai, all to a strategic end, which was to get himself reelected, to box Russia out strategically, to open China to Western trade. And it had an unexpected benefit, which was that people saw this on television and in the magazines and newspapers, and they saw this delicious food that they'd never tried before, all this stuff from parts of China that were not represented in American restaurants. And so there was this great clamor to have new kinds of Chinese food in America. He was very immodest about this. He said this was one of the most important meals of the 20th century, but he was actually right.
Oh, how about that?
So, cottage cheese and Chinese food.
Bill Clinton.
Clinton, well, Clinton's an interesting case. He started off as a fast food junkie, as you may have heard, and he had a very bad heart. And Hillary took it upon herself to re-educate him and to give him a healthier diet. So she brought in a chef named Walter Scheib, who was a kind of a fusion cooking cook who used really healthy ingredients, and weaned him off of fast food, got him eating healthier, more and more vegetables. He ultimately became a vegetarian and then a vegan after he left the White House. He has slipped a bit since then. I've heard he's now eating, sort of poached chicken and salmon, but I can't blame the guy. And he looks much healthier, and he survived. And he really said he wanted to know his grandchildren, and he's a mission accomplished.
Barack Obama.
Barack Obama famously was a foodie. He was brought up in Hawaii, but also in Indonesia. His stepfather was Indonesian, and in Jakarta. And so he had a really, I think, the most global palate of any president. Second was Herbert Hoover, who had lived around the world as a mining executive. But Obama really followed food and still does. When he come to New York, I remember I live in New York. He would come to New York with Obama on date night, and they would shut down, Lower East Side, where all the hip restaurants were. And he knew exactly where to go and what to order. And he was famously a healthy eater, which is unusual for a foodie. So he managed to balance that out. And the old joke was that he would only eat 7 almonds as a snack. Now, it turned out that this was a joke that Sam Cass, his personal chef, told the New York Times, and everybody believed it. And Obama said, well, sometimes I'll have as many as 9 almonds. But when he comes to mind, I think of arugula, because he got himself in trouble. He was in Iowa campaigning, and he said, have you seen the price of arugula at Whole Foods these days? You're never going to believe it. And the farmers looked at him dumbstruck, because number one, there were no Whole Foods in Iowa, and number two, they didn't even know what arugula was. And it labeled him as a foodie elitist. Which they used him, the Republicans used to bang him around the head with. But, at the end of the day, as I said, people really followed the Obama's examples. And when Michelle planted the White House kitchen garden, so-called, a lot of people did the same and followed suit.
Yeah. 2 other quick ones. So, do we know anything about Joe Biden's taste in food other than ice cream?
Well, Joe, he's a regular Joe. He likes spaghetti with red sauce and ice cream, most famously chocolate chip ice cream. But it turns out that Jill Biden is actually a very accomplished cook, as is Kamala Harris. And Jill grew up with Italian grandparents who would make homemade pasta and braccioli and beautiful breads. And she really likes to cook. And so she says, Joe's not allowed near the stove, but I think she feeds him pretty well. And they like to go out for dinner to restaurants around town. And there was a big kerfuffle last year when they both ordered the same thing in an Italian restaurant, which seemed like much ado about nothing. I don't know why that was even an issue, but it was, because people are looking for something to talk about, I guess.
By the way, that was the night that Joe Biden did that top secret trip to Kyiv in Ukraine.
Is that
and
right?
so the date night was a fake date.
Wow.
I mean, they actually went out for dinner.
Yeah, and
they
then
went
jumped
out
on the
early, on the early side. Everybody couldn't figure that out. They went to the Red Hen. They both had, you're right, I forget what pasta. They both ordered the same thing. But they were back in the White House by about 9 o'clock. And I mean, like those of us who follow the White House, I'm part of the White House press corps, were thinking, what the hell's going on? Why are they back so early? But they pulled it off. 10 o'clock, he was on his way to Andrews, and
That's amazing. I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
that
Good.
was-
Well,
that was-
breaking news, everybody.
okay. The rest, just recipes are such fun at the end. What is the one recipe that you mentioned about Eisenhower steak? Just mention one other that your favorite. Why'd
well,
you put it in here?
There are 10 recipes. I tried them all. I used my friends as guinea pigs, and I made sure that these were recipes that everybody could do. There's everything from cocktails, which is FDR's reverse martini, a favorite of Julia Child's, by the way.
By the way, I'll just stop you there. Highly recommend that. So, like a martini is basically 4 times gin and then 1 little bit of vermouth. FDR did it just the opposite. So he could have several martinis. People would think he could put that away. He was really drinking 4 times vermouth to 1 little slit of gin.
Yeah, Julia always said,
Yeah.
the great advantage of the reverse martinis, you can have 2 of them. But I do desserts and I do entrees. One of my favorite is a soup called Billy B,
Yes.
which William Howard Taft was very fond of. It's a mussel soup based on the soups of Normandy that became a big hit in Paris and in the early 1900s. And it's a beautiful soup. It's easy to make. It's mussels with a bit of cream, some wine, and some herbs. I tweaked the recipe a little bit in here, and I tell you the story about how Craig Claiborne of the New York Times declared this one of the finest things ever made. And it really is fun and delicious and easy, and if you like mussels, the original recipe takes the mussel flesh out of the soup, but I'm a real mussel-holic, and so I put the mussels back in. And I recommend it because it makes it a more beautiful soup. And that's one that has a special place in my heart.
So, as Julia would say, bon appétit. Alex, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill.
Seriously, strongly, highly recommend the book, and copies here, thanks to our friends from East City Books. And it's now out in paperback, so I encourage you to buy it, and you'll enjoy it. As
Fresh
much
off the
as-
presses, just
There it
came
is.
out, President's Day. So,
Yeah.
Here.
Questions for Alex? Sir, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. I should remind you, wait for the microphone, please, so we can record them as well, your questions as well. Thank you.
In your research, did you find there's consensus on, say, who was considered the finest White House chef or the worst White House chef?
Well, the worst White House purveyor of food was a woman named Henrietta Nesbitt. And this is an ironic story because she worked for FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor had met her in Hyde Park. She was down on her luck, and Eleanor liked the bread that she made, so she hired Mrs. Nesbitt, as she was known, to bake bread for the campaign. FDR won, and on Eleanor's insistence, she brought Henrietta and her husband to the White House. Now, at the White House, her job was to be the housekeeper. So she didn't do the actual cooking, but she was in charge of the kitchen. She laid out the menu, she did the shopping. The problem was, and FDR, by the way, was a real gourmet, somebody who loves fine food as opposed to a gourmand, which is someone like his cousin Teddy Roosevelt, who eats to wretched excess. But FDR was a real gourmet. He loved exotic foods. But he was subjected to Mrs. Nesbitt's horrible fare. She believed that leftovers were king, everything should be canned or mashed, that salads should be made out of Jell-O and things like candy canes. Really horrid, and it was sort of a torture for the gourmet president to have this kind of food. And this is where food, I think, is so interesting on a psychological level. It gives you a look into behind the curtains at the White House, what happens in the private quarters, and the president's internal life. So FDR would fantasize about food, and he would talk about it all the time. He was really obsessed, but he was eating this horrible glop, and he would complain. He would say, I've been served sweetbread 6 days in a row, and doesn't Mrs. Nesbitt know there are other cereals other than oatmeal? And the question is, why? Why did the most powerful man in the world not control his own diet? Well, the Roosevelts never really answered that question directly, but there's a hint in that Eleanor discovered that Franklin was having an affair with her former social secretary, Lucy Mercer. And this was a real devastating news to her. Eleanor's father had been having affairs and died in he was a drunk and he had a terrible car wreck, and this brought up all those memories, and she felt very wounded by this. And so there's some people who believe that Mrs. Nesbitt's horrible fare presided over the White House as an example to the nation of how to eat economically during the Second World War, how to use ration goods. Ernest Hemingway said one of the worst meals he'd ever had in his life was at the Roosevelt White House. Others believe that this was a tool of Eleanor's domestic revenge. And I'm in the latter camp. In terms of the best White House food, you really have to look at the era. I mean, Thomas Jefferson was known as our greatest epicure. He had when he was in the White House, he had a series of French chefs who were really splendid. There have been many. I mean, Henry Holler, who I mentioned, was a Swiss
Sam
chef.
Cass.
Yeah. Sam Cass was the personal chef to the Obamas. He was a very healthy cook. I wouldn't say he was on par with some of the best. Holler's predecessor was René Verdon, the French chef who Jackie Kennedy hired. The Kennedys famously had these wonderful meals. Mrs. Kennedy offered the job to my friend Jacques Pepin, but he had been the chef for the president of France, for Charles de Gaulle, and he thought that position really had no meaning, and so he turned it down and went to work for Howard Johnson's instead, with no regrets, he says today. But René Verdon was a really splendid cook, and Jackie Kennedy's meals probably equaled Jefferson's in quality. So that's a long-winded answer, but you know.
Sure.
Personal question, but your relationship to Julia Child I didn't know about, but I had jumped to a conclusion, given your last name, that you were some relation to Paul Prudhomme, who had started the great interest in New Orleans and Cajun Creole cooking. So I assume that's not true, or is it? And number two, is there any indication that any particular president's culinary interests, sparked something wide or nationwide in a particular kind of cuisine?
Both good questions. I'll answer the first. So Paul Prudhomme, famous Cajun chef from New Orleans, his restaurant was K. Paul's. He was a 350-pound ball of energy. He briefly had a restaurant in New York, and so I went by and introduced myself. And he got around on a little scooter. He poured us each a Cajun martini, which was a bell jar this big full of booze. And he slugged his back, and I'm sitting there sipping mine timidly. And I said, "Chef, do you think we're related? We have this name in common." And he said, "Well, you spell your name with an apostrophe in the middle, Prudhomme. That means you're a prudent man. You're a smart guy, aren't you?" And I'm like, I don't know. He said, "You spell it my way, no apostrophe, that means stubborn mule." And I said, "Well, I'm pretty stubborn, you're pretty smart. We got to be related way back somewhere." And we agreed over the Cajun martinis that it turns out, I did some research, the Prudhommes were counselors to the French king. They were the prudent men. They didn't do a very good job because they got booted out of France after the Revolution. And so there were Prudhommes spread all around the world, just none left in France. And so we have these epic family reunions where we have people from America and Belgium and Ireland and Italy and all over the place, and we get together and we eat and drink and talk, and it's kind of amazing that we had, a lot of the times we haven't met each other before, but we're sort of instantly simpatico. So that's the Prudhomme story. And I forget what your second question was about. Oh, yeah. Well, as I mentioned at the outset, the public really pays attention to what the president eats. And so, for example, Reagan with his jelly beans, that's an interesting story because he actually used jelly beans, he used the sugar as a way to wean himself off of tobacco. He was a pipe smoker, even though he had featured in cigarette ads, and Nancy Reagan didn't want him smoking cigarettes. And so he started eating jelly beans. And then he began to notice that he would keep this jar of jelly beans on his desk, And when people would come and visit him, there was a big difference between those who took out just one color versus those who just grabbed a handful of all the colors. And he thought, well, that would tell you something about what kind of person they were. And he kind of used these as a personal brand, the way that Trump later used McBurgers as the fast food president. And so jelly beans were very successful, and the ones he liked the best were made by the Herman Goelitz Company, and they're called Jelly Bellies, and they're kind of high-end jelly beans, if you will, if there is such a thing. And the Herman Goelitz Company went from a small little company to this giant, national phenomenon because of Reagan, because so many people started buying the Jelly Bellies, and they started shipping red, white, and blue jelly beans to the White House, and so that was a case where it did affect the public. But then there was a backlash when Reagan defunded the federal school lunch program by nearly $1.5 billion, and declared that ketchup and relish were vegetables. On the same day, just by chance, that Nancy Reagan ordered a very beautiful but expensive new set of White House china. And the message from that was that sugar and new china was more important than kids' lunch. And that was sort of a reaction that from all sides of the political spectrum against Reagan and his jelly beans. So I say in the book that when you're the president, every bite counts for better and for worse.
Yeah, right. Questions here? One here in the middle. Okay. There we go. Yeah. And then we'll come to you next. Yeah.
Are there any examples of dramatic diplomatic failures at state dinners?
Are there any examples of diplomatic failures at state dinners? Well, state dinners are the culmination of days or weeks of very serious, sometimes tense diplomatic negotiations. And so the dinner is kind of the exclamation point at the end of that process. And they're very carefully choreographed because they don't want any faux pas. And I don't know, I was looking for that myself, and I didn't find anything. But the White House is very good at covering things up
Yeah.
when they need to.
Yeah.
Maybe Bill knows of one, but there was this moment with that Julia Child captured on film when Ford's bicentennial dinner for the Queen kind of went sideways. Not through any fault of his own, except for maybe hiring the Captain and Tennille. But he was in a re-election campaign. He was up against Jimmy Carter, and he was trying to play the populist card by having Captain and Tennille there. But I don't, the dinners are very carefully planned out because they don't want anybody getting sick or having any problems. And so the White House chefs told me that they don't ever serve something like raw garlic because that could lead to unfortunate circumstances around the table. They don't serve something like sushi because not everybody likes raw fish. They choreograph the dinner through the State Department and the ambassadors with the guest of honor to find out what they like. And generally, a state dinner represents the very best of American food and wine. And there's usually a nod to the guest country. So, for example, when the Reagans hosted the Gorbachevs, they served wine from the Russian River Valley in California, which is very good wine, but it was a region settled by a lot of Russians. And so there was a nod to the guest in that. So I don't know of any terrible failures at state dinner. So I do have another failure, though, which was when George W. Bush was president.
That's the one I was thinking.
Yeah.
It wasn't on American soil, but yeah.
Well, there was George H.W. Bush,
That's what
who
yeah.
notoriously got sick in Japan,
Yeah.
threw up and passed out on camera. And a crank called into CNN and said, "The president's dead." And they were about to go live with this when they triple checked and they discovered, no, he just had food poisoning and got sick and he was fine. So luckily they saved that. But his son, George W. Bush, liked to have baseball-themed dinners. As you may recall, he was a part owner of the Texas Rangers. He liked to have Little League games on the White House lawn. And he would have famous baseball players come for dinner or lunch. And in this case was at lunch. Walter Scheib, who had been hired by the Clintons as this healthy food guy, consulted with Laura Bush about the menu. And I think it was Yogi Berra, Sandy Koufax, some of the greats were there for lunch. Now, W didn't like anything that he thought was slimy, quote unquote. So Scheib serves this beautiful meal, and the opening course is a green soup. It's a sorrel soup with artichokes and pink shrimp in it. And the waiters bring this out, and everybody's getting ready to dig in when W shoots back in his chair and says, "What the heck is this? Something that washed up on the shore?" And the waiters panicked, and they brought all the soups back into the kitchen, and the cooks are saying, "What the heck's going on here?" They had no idea. And then Scheib realized, oh, it's pink and green. He thinks it's slimy. So they quickly fired up the veal steaks and got them out and saved the day. But it was a near disaster because W didn't approve.
One question, we're going to make this the last question. Right, you had your hand up, right?
Yep. Yeah. Have you noticed any partisan trends in terms of which foods are liked or disliked? I mean, there's a stereotype, whether accurate or not, that, kale, for example, is a very progressive food.
Kale versus
smoothies.
steak is kind of the trope. Yeah. Well, I asked a lot of people about that because I was curious too. Is there sort of red state and blue state food? And ultimately they said no. Really, it's up to individual taste. And when you really look carefully, most of the presidents are meat and potatoes guys. Even Obama. He liked a good steak, and when he was campaigning, he ate a lot of hamburgers, even though he was famous for his kale and his arugula. And the funny thing for me, though, is that the wives tend to eat much healthier than the men, and draw your own conclusions from that about our nation and the rest, and myself included. And when the first ladies would leave town, the men would revert to sort of Cro-Magnon food. So the wives would have, Nancy Reagan famously rode herd on Ron and made sure he ate healthily. Same with Hillary Clinton, with Bill. And as soon as the first ladies left town, the men would order thick steaks with onion rings and milkshakes and all sorts of the stuff that they weren't allowed to eat normally. And then they would swear, he would make the chef swear confidentiality because they knew they'd get in trouble. And Roland Mesnier, who was a wonderful French pastry chef, said that had Nancy learned that I served him this double thick chocolate cake, I would have been fired immediately. That was the only kind of, it was more of a gender divide than a red state, blue state thing.
Yeah. What a fun evening with Alex Prud'homme. Thank you, Alex, so much.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you all.
Paperbacks available right outside. Alex will be glad to hang around for a little while.
I'd be happy to sign a book.
And we'll let you know when the next Talk of the Hill comes. Thank you. Thanks
Thank
for
you
coming.
all. Thank you,
Good
Bill.
night. Yeah.